The Canadians call Victoria, the capital of British Columbia on Vancouver Island, their most English city, a piece of the old empire originally settled by the British as a post of the Hudson Bay Company. Nowadays, young people come here from all over Canada to start life. The old folk retire here to avoid the awful winters of the East. The locals cheerfully describe the population as newlywed or nearly dead. The Englishness expresses itself in workaday ways. There is a perfect replica of Anne Hathaway's cottage, real brick and real thatch. But in the centre of the city, there are reminders that the British were come-lately settlers. This was Indian country for 1,000 years. These days, their totem poles are carefully restored and refurbished. So it was Victoria that was chosen as the starting place for this long tour, and British Columbians turned out in fair numbers for their first look at the Princess. The Prince, on his 9th visit to Canada, was keen to get the introductions going.
It's a particular pleasure to be able to introduce my wife to this great Pacific province and to let her see for herself and to find out for herself just what a warm-hearted lot you all are.
The crowd liked his style and whooped their pleasure. They liked it better still when the first walkabout began. The Princess looked remarkably fresh after the 10-hour flight from London, but jet lag was taking its toll, and both later confessed to feeling disoriented, not quite sure what they were at. They were to have little chance to recover from this initial tiredness. The ferryboat Queen of the North brought them through the misted fjords and islands towards the city of Vancouver. The Mounties band made it seem a bit like a voyage on Britannia. Unfortunately, a full gale was blowing. A gentle cruise became a test of endurance. Better to shelter in the deckhouse. Not an option open to the poor Mounties, now in some disarray. By the time the Queen of the North reached Lionsgate Bridge, the waters were calmer, though the wind was still high and the Princess decided shelter was still necessary. The band was back in business again, and Vancouver's welcome unfolded. This was their first sight of the World Fair Expo '86, and their first sight of Vancouver's crowds, who would follow them everywhere in the next 7 days. There was a state banquet that evening, causing Vancouver society, normally staid and polite, to fight for tickets. The host was the Prime Minister, Mr. Mulroney, who was fulsome, to say the least, in his praise of the Princess.
I want to extend a particularly warm welcome to the Princess on her first visit to the West Coast. Here, as everywhere else, she wins people's hearts, for they see in her much more than a woman of radiant style. They see a person of innate kindness and inner grace.
Afterwards, in wind and rain, with the Princess swathed in a cloak, they watched the fireworks. It was a pretty spectacular display. But the lasers were remarkable. The whole of the next day, 10 hours of it to be precise, the Prince and Princess were in attendance at the opening festivities of Expo '86. The site covers 173 acres of Vancouver's waterfront, and they covered most of it. The best way to see it all, and the least harmful on the feet, is by boat. So that's how they started, cruising past the pavilions of 54 nations. Expo has cost $2 billion and expects to get 15 million visitors by the autumn. If it doesn't, the people of British Columbia will be paying an awful lot of extra tax. The actual opening ceremony was in the BC Stadium, known locally as the Burger Bun. Its fiberglass roof kept aloft by pressurized air. The place is vast and daunting, and much the same could be said for the ceremonial. For car buffs, the royal vehicle is a 1939 McLaughlin Buick. A combination of car and couple brought the house down. The Prime Minister did the honours again, that characteristically honeyed voice working overtime.
And we say, come to Vancouver, come to Canada. What a welcome and what a world awaits you here.
Already euphoria was abroad, made complete by the Prince.
We have the greatest pleasure in declaring Expo 86 officially open.
He got a standing ovation for that one. Then pure Canadian kitsch, with simultaneously dancers, a fly past and a royal lap of honour. There are times when excess becomes an art form. Now the serious Expo touring had to begin with first the monorail. The Princess said, "Are we on the right platform?" It turned out to be her first and last joke about Expo. Mind you, the monorail really was rather fun. By her standards, the Princess's fashion had been a bit quiet so far, dull, the Canadian papers called it. Then she turned up at a rock concert in a black dinner jacket and baggy trousers. Conservative Vancouverites goggled, and the Prince had a bit of a jolt too. She got the dinner jacket idea when she borrowed one of her husband's for a London outing. Now she'd improved on the theme. Very fetching. But the heavy, almost relentless schedule of events was beginning to wear her down, particularly the constant touring of Expo pavilions, 5 hours of it at a time. On this hot Vancouver day, she went to the Saudi Arabian pavilion after 2 hours' work in the morning and an official lunch. Then the Russian pavilion for a look at their spacecraft. Then the British pavilion, voted unanimously by the critics as Expo's dullest. Then the American pavilion, embarrassingly extolling the achievements of NASA. By the time she approached her fifth pavilion of the afternoon, California, she was looking hot, tired, and pale. The stuffy atmosphere inside got to her. Lost in the crowds for a moment, she stumbled and briefly fainted. She was led away, much distressed, by her doctor, Surgeon Commander Ian Jenkins. The Prince followed behind. She recovered in the pavilion's washroom. The police, fearing the worst, did a certain amount of panicking. The ambulance was not required, and in a short while she was driven away, waving a little weakly. That night, there was yet another banquet. By then, she'd had an hour's rest with her feet up. There was no question she would not attend. She was composed, but still very pale. Yet more Expo pavilions awaited her next day, though the Japanese could at least provide her with a taste of the tour to come. She was wearing a red outfit which seemed to heighten her pallor, but she was cheerier and determined to carry on with the job. The Japanese, mercifully, had managed to make their pavilion bright and entertaining. They were shown a model of the city of the future, which looked depressingly like the city of today. The Princess was at her most wistful, seeming rather vulnerable. The Prince was enjoying himself. Both looked tired. What they faced now was a long flight to Japan and another hard tour. What they needed was a little peace, a little tranquility. The temple of Shisendo requires the removal of shoes, and the tour is conducted in stocking feet. In temples like this, the beams are a bit low for a Western princess. Mind your head, said the interpreter. Shisendo, built in 1641, is the temple of a sect of Zen Buddhism. Its stream and hollow bamboo combine to measure time. It's customary for visitors to feed the fish, which are also nourished by the stream, and it must be said they do get very well fed, producing these koi carp. Nijo Castle, standing firm against the encroachments of the modern city of Kyoto, goes back to the great samurai days of Japan in the 17th century. A swan on the moat now guards the scene of so many feudal battles, not to mention so many samurai movies. It was here the couple were introduced to the tea ceremony, beginning with the little rice cakes which always precede the brew itself. The prince dug in with his spoon. The princess discovered, as everyone does, that they're hard to chew, harder to swallow. The artist in charge went through the ritual of cleansing the cup with his bamboo whisk. It's a lengthy process, timed by tradition. There's no such thing as a quick brew around here. The prince burped gently in anticipation. Finally, the master poured the water onto the tea, a ground green powder. And the prince now entered into the spirit of the ceremony, swirling the cup and then taking a long draught. Its bitterness surprised him slightly, but he managed the correct bow. A servant delivered the second cup to the princess, freshly and separately brewed, of course. Her reaction was something on the lines of, "Not as bad as I'd thought." The cup was then ritually wiped in the unhurried manner of the ceremonial, and that should have been the end of it. But the princess wanted to see how it was done. The master showed her, explaining that the ceremony was less about having a cup of tea, more about refining the mind. The kimono, the one on the left being priceless, the one on the right worth about £40,000, was less of a mystery to the Westerners, especially to a fashion-wise princess who moved in to feel the material. That was a short step to trying one on, first of all just over the shoulders. Though the handbag was an encumbrance. Then she put her arms in the sleeves properly to get the full effect. It was too long, but even so, she attempted an experimental shuffle. All of which produced a happier laugh than we'd seen for days. At another Zen Buddhist temple, Tofukuji, the monks walked slightly faster than their usual pace. The prince had asked specially to see this shrine that's been here since 1235. He came here alone and had a long talk with the chief priest after his tour. The subject was the contemplative life. A novice monk risked a quick glimpse before returning to the closed-eyed meditation. At the end of the visit, the prince took in the isolation and the peace. He said he'd like to stay longer. The monks believed him. In Tokyo, there was the razzmatazz of an open-car parade, with the prince's detective giving precise instructions on what to do if things went wrong. Sensible advice in view of the terrorist attacks in the week just past. But it all went well, and the crowds were as big as any the couple have experienced. Outside the city's most famous department store, the crowds pressed their noses to the plate glass, hoping for a sighting. Inside, something quite unexpected. A choir of Japanese schoolchildren singing a song that ought to be familiar to both of them. The serious purpose of the visit to Tokyo was to address both houses of the Diet, the Parliament, and to make a plea for better understanding between the two peoples.
We need to exchange more of our cultures, and by doing so, enrich our creativity. That is the way that reconciles and enriches hearts and minds, and leads to greater understanding and better communications.
One of those cultural exchanges we might find hard to take is Kabuki, the stylized classical theatre of old Japan. This is Danjuro Ichikawa, whose family have been Kabuki actors for 12 generations. Getting him ready takes almost as long as the performance, not to mention his voice. Everything has to be absolutely right, and absolutely the same as centuries of tradition dictate. On this day, the attention to detail was remarkable, since he was going to meet the prince and princess. And the voice still wasn't quite right. As a matter of fact, he was a little tongue-tied when the meeting took place. Sumo wrestling is one of the biggest spectator sports in Japan and very big on television. They even have cameras up in the ceiling like snooker, but snooker this isn't. They come even bigger than this man, up to 34 stone. The fight is deceptively simple. Push your opponent out of the ring, hence the advantage of weight. That one lasted 9 seconds. Sumo, after 400 years, is as formalized as, well, Kabuki. Suddenly the crowd gets agitated. You realize why Japanese cameras sell so well. Enter the prince and princess, about to chalk up another first. It's at this stage that sumo fights are won and lost. When eyeball contact is established, the psyching has started. But they're so fat, said the princess. The big one, or bigger one, is now really psyching his opponent. The opponent is definitely worried, as well he might be, giving away about 10 stone. You don't have to be an expert to predict the result. Polite applause and a glance that sums up Western reaction. Backstage, the star looked more benign, but still large. He said he thought the princess was pretty, but needed more weight. That evening, they went to a banquet at the Imperial Palace to meet the Emperor, unseen throughout the tour. For the occasion, the princess wore her most stunning dress of the tour, a clinging blue silk affair by the Japanese designer Yuki, who's based in London. With it, a headband of diamonds with a sapphire in the center. She was bowed into the plain, formal elegance of the palace. In an anteroom, His Imperial Majesty Hirohito, 60 years on the chrysanthemum throne, survivor of a devastating world war, now looked upon by many Japanese as once more a god emperor. He's an often taciturn man, and the setup didn't encourage animated conversation. It's not easy to talk when your host is the far side of a large flower arrangement. It was the princess who walked into dinner with the emperor, trying to match his measured tread. And it was the princess who, with gestures, finally started the talk going. In return, the emperor, though of course he outranks a princess, deferred to her and waited until she was seated. The table was beautifully set, the atmosphere not a little starchy, but it did seem that slowly the old gentleman's heart was warmed. They went straight to the airport in their evening clothes. The tour across the Pacific was almost over. For sheer hard work on both their parts, it will take some beating, and the fainting episode has left a nasty memory. But there are memories of happiness, of wonder, and fun too. Time now only for a wifely warning: watch your head.